Paige, I really appreciate you making time to be on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me on, Mike.
I feel like this is way overdue because I've been so fascinated with the world that you live in and really deeply didn't understand it.
You're not the only one.
Yeah, I know. As you said before we hit record, right? Some of your friends still don't know what you do. So if you're listening and you're one of Paige's friends, hopefully by the end of this, you'll get a clear idea of what she does every day. But I thought, once the more I got to understand, as you shared information, the more I got to understand what you do, I'm like, I've got to have you on the podcast. And funnily enough, we know each other because you're an competitive Olympic lifter. I do CrossFit. We happen to work out at the same gym and see each other all the time and have developed a friendship and gotten to chat about work. And so that's kind of what led to this. And at first, I thought you worked in like cybersecurity, which it turned out you don't.
So does everyone. It's okay.
Okay, well, this is where we get to dispel all the myths about you here. So when I understood that you actually worked in threat assessment and mitigation, I'm like, ooh, okay, well, that's a compelling topic that I think a lot of listeners would want to know more about, particularly in this like day and age where we are, more and more public or private information is public now. And that presents great opportunities for business to be able to prospect, but it also presents great opportunities for nefarious actors to be able to have access to people and to their loved ones that they should not have access to. So before we dive into that, I would love for you to just start with your origin story. Why this? Like, how did you even get started down this road?
Yeah, that's what I'd like to know. So I actually studied international security at the University of Edinburgh. That's where I went to grad school. And I was way more what you might call zoomed out. Like I was really looking from a top-down level at Canada's military policy, foreign policy in the Middle East. And because I was interested in things like, why did Canada follow the US into Afghanistan, but only 2 years later didn't follow them into Iraq? So these were like kind of high level, almost like international relations topics, but very much through a security lens. And I was studying that because I wanted to go into military intelligence. I really wanted to serve my country. It was a big deal for me, the idea that I was going to sort of put the uniform on and really give something back to Canada as, a third generation Canadian. And, to cut a long story short, it just didn't work out. And I had to find something else to do where I thought, how can I still serve Canadian interests? To the degree that that's possible using what I've studied. And, I knew that critical energy infrastructure is a big deal. It's part of national security, especially now people have become acutely aware of that. And so I started doing consulting work little by little, mainly with big energy companies in Canada, to try to empower them with information. What threats do you face? Do you know who these groups are, the people? Is it threats to your assets, your personnel, your offices? And then how can we minimize that? Because, that's just how the country works. We have to have energy. And so that's how it started. I have other clients now, but that was really my bread and butter at the start.
And so once you got into the energy sector and you started to understand the various threats and then how to mitigate those threats, whether it's to assets or to people, my guess is at that point, you're like, okay, well, there's some crossover there's lots of other industries out there that can have nefarious actors that are coming after them in some way. So what's the breadth of the types of industries that you've worked in after starting off in energy?
Yeah, so it started to go into other things and things you wouldn't expect, like ecotourism. So for example, a lot of the groups or people that are against, say, oil and gas also don't like any sort of major infrastructure that they feel is encroaching onto natural spaces. So a ski resort, for example, could face a lot of pushback from the same groups of people that don't like oil pipelines, because fundamentally they see this as like a climate justice issue. And then, and it can sort of spin into different things. So the narrative that gets built around some of these things, oh, you are privatizing public, beautiful spaces. And then you start getting into issues of almost like economic justice or class justice. And so that was kind of something. Then we started seeing it with insurance companies. Well, an oil pipeline needs insurance. So now we're going to target the insurance companies, and not just the companies, but the CEOs. We're going to call them out by name. We're going to wage name and shame campaigns against them on social media. And so they'll find any avenue to target these projects. And so the scope of, the companies I was dealing with grew over time.
There was an interesting case. And when you said ecotourism, the first thing that popped in my mind was, so you and I both live in Vancouver, and there's a project on the way to Whistler Mountain. Halfway, there's a lovely community that's a growing community called Squamish. And Squamish decided to allow the building of a sea to sky gondola. So basically a tourist attraction that allowed people to go up beside the second largest exposed granite monolith in the world, which is a huge climbing route. But this would give people the opportunity to go up and see the area of Howe Sound and just have this beautiful view and explore nature. Well, not long after it was built, somebody actually climbed up the tower of one of the gondolas and cut the cable. And the gondolas and the cable, which is incredibly heavy metal cable, they came crashing to the ground. So, just like who hates this thing? It's like a great draw for employment to the local community. It's bringing tourism in, the tourism that normally would have just gone straight to Whistler and bypassed Squamish unless they're getting gas. And so the first time it happened, it was like, okay, well, somebody maybe has a beef with the organization, who knows? But then it happened again. And then, of course, the insurance is a problem when you're trying to insure something like that. So they had to come up with all these strategies to help to mitigate in terms of actually taking the gondola cars off at night in case somebody tried to cut the cable again, so they wouldn't lose all the gondola cables, cameras and lighting systems. And there's a whole bunch of, I don't even know the totality of the mitigation strategies they put into place there. But I never understood that until you made the comment about ecotourism. And I was like, okay, well, now this makes a little bit more sense as to why somebody might have gone and done something like this.
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with that case, partially just because I'm from the area, but it was also a very disturbing example of how you'd think, okay, how many people could have done this? Because if you actually got into the weeds about what the actual sabotage looked like, this would have to have been someone who had some climbing skills, knew how to use like a metal grinder. I mean, we're not talking about cutting a nylon piece of rope. This is like a major metal cable. And like you said, for it to happen twice, and the RCMP still have not apprehended anyone, and you can look at it from so many different angles too. Like a lot of people who really purport anyway to care a lot about Indigenous land rights, sometimes projects get on those grounds because they'll say, well, the relevant First Nations haven't given consent. But when they did the opening after the second cable cutting, representatives of the Squamish First Nation were there, and they actually participated in an opening ceremony and kind of gave their blessing to the whole thing. So it gets rapidly very complicated trying to determine who really the opponents are to these things. It can be quite mystifying for people who don't look into it.
I'm curious, when you get engaged, what are the various types of threats? And maybe I'm going to say the most common threats. Maybe that's not the right way to consider it, but what are the most, maybe it is the right question. What are the most common threats that you investigate?
So it's kind of 50-50. We try to split them between, say, reputational and operational. So part of what will happen, especially if a project is still in its permitting phase, lots of times projects have to go through formal, public comment periods before they get FID, final investment decision, or, there's many layers to this. So a lot of times at that point, it'll be reputation savaging of the project itself or the proponents, whoever they are. And they'll say, look at this company. This company is known to abuse Indigenous people in the Amazon, or the CEO of this company, look at all, he's known for tax evasion. And they'll really try to, build this story up of this company's terrible. We don't want them here. A lot of times, especially now, companies, they're Trump adjacent. It'll be something like that. Oh, it's foreign actors,
Right.
But then once a project gets under construction, there's active construction happening, or it's finished and the sites become operational, Then it's more things like, well, do you have people trying to sabotage the actual infrastructure, valve
Mm.
turners, people, arsons, things like that. So that's kind of the range, reputational and operational.
And so outside of reputational and operational, there's also that human component too, where there is the physical security of either the executive team or could be the workers that are there day to day. If something is sabotaged, then their health and safety could be also affected by that. It could be the children or the family members of executives or the CEO. So what does that side look like?
Okay, I could give you two examples right away. So when
Sure.
the Coastal GasLink pipeline, this is an LNG pipeline that it's built now across northern BC. The terminus point is the major LNG Canada facility in Kitimat. So when that pipeline was under construction, there was an incident not that long ago, like 4 or 5 years ago, at a drill site. Masked assailants in the middle of the night basically attacked the site and workers at the site, to the point where like an axe was thrown through the back of a worker's truck while he was sitting in it. They tried to block roads so people couldn't leave. There were just all like, cause millions in damage. Never mind, you have people who oftentimes they've been flown into these remote work sites. They're away from their family and they're thinking, why am I bothering with this? I don't want to work here. So, and then it gets very creepy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who are these people? Where did they come from? There's some evidence that people who participated in that attack were actually flown in and then flown out, so it would be harder to identify them later on. So that kind of like anarchist element to some of these activist movements can be quite violent. And then outside work sites, if we're talking about like CEOs being targeted, David Letty, so he is in charge of Leadcore. They're a major contracting company. They're all over BC. They work on many projects. Sometimes you'll even see Leadcore signs like at residential builds, but they also work on oil and gas projects.
Mm-hmm.
There was a whole group of youth activists that showed up at his house, and they wore black bloc style clothing, bandanas to mask their face. They had a prop with like a pig head and fake blood, and they basically staged a whole intimidation show outside of his house. I think it was in North Vancouver. So what is he supposed to make of that? He's there with his kids. His wife's probably totally terrified. They're just kind of in their house waiting for these people to go. And you have to wonder, like, okay, how did they know his address? How did they know he was going to be home at that time? Raises a whole bunch of really creepy questions very quickly.
And so so now we're starting to talk about, we're sort of moving from that threat assessment place to now, I think we need to talk about threat mitigation. So now when you know what the threats could be to either, the reputation, or it could be to, as you say, to the operations, and now also physical threats to people. Let's talk about the mitigation piece of this. So when you know approximately what you think the threats are, what are the types of mitigation strategies that you need to put into place?
Well, just going back to the David Letty example, I do what's called digital vulnerability assessments very often. So let's say you are the CEO of a company and you'd say, let's say, just pretend you're a bad actor. What can you find out about me? And that's kind of what I do. I sort of play bad guy and try to scrape the underbelly of the internet to find information that could be used against this person. This is just a random example, but one time I was doing one of these and I was able to find the soccer practice schedule of this particular CEO's child online, because it was just a publicly posted schedule on the school website. It doesn't seem, harmful. I'm sure the coach just thought, well, that's an accessible way to see the schedule. But now I know where your kids are going to be, where, at what time. Maybe your wife's going to be there too. So that's the kind of thing where, okay, now we know that information. Let's intervene. Let's mitigate. Go to the school and say, hey, can we have a private group chat just for parents of children on this team where that schedule is posted? We don't need to have that on the school website. Easy example. Some other ones, people really need to see what is on Google Street View as well. You can find, I know, the make, model, plate of your children's cars now, because there's photos of them outside your house. Your wife likes to blog about her cycling activity, but now her daily cycle, including her start point, which is her house, is on Strava. So now I know, and it's little things like
Right.
that. People just don't think about it. They're just participating in their community. Maybe they have a cycling club, but now all of a sudden
Right.
that's a vulnerability.
Sure.
And maybe you just don't need to put that out there or make your Strava private. A lot of it's just privacy settings, but people just don't know.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think about that. My obviously the podcast has a public page, but my private, like Instagram, is private. And I know every single person that's on there and following me. And that was intentional because we have a daughter. And I was very clear when she was first born. I'm like, yeah, no pictures, like all of that stuff is staying for our friends and family to stay in touch with our family. But I don't want that out there in the world. And it's interesting because, the privacy piece of it, I understand. There's the flip side of it is like, as a CEO of a company, I also need to have a public brand. And I'm like, okay, well, that public brand can be expressed through LinkedIn. That public brand can be expressed through the podcast, through the podcast website, but it is not going to be, or it can be expressed through my own company website, but is not going to be expressed through Instagram or Facebook. So I lock those two down. And then I'm judicious in the approach that I use to the other forms of social media, knowing that anyone that listens, like they have to listen to a bunch of podcast episodes, go to a website, and then all of a sudden they can piece together way too much about me, which I'm not interested in.
What's really interesting about that is sometimes the quote unquote bad guys also don't realize what they're putting out about themselves. And so I've had some interesting cases where we can kind of flip it back the other way. So let's say you have someone who, really doesn't have a lot else to do other than to be an organizer of some, say, anti-pipeline movement.
Right.
And, everyone wants clout and recognition within the circle of people in which they see value, right? So there have been interesting cases where someone says, well, I wasn't, in violation of a court-ordered injunction. And it's like, but you videoed yourself violating it. And in the video, you state that your intent is to block and disrupt this project. So, it's very funny. People do want that recognition, whether they're on the activist side or the business side, and people just don't realize what information can be used against them if they don't really think it through.
And so when you're in that position where you've managed to pull that information, are you then feeding that to lawyers for them to then go deal with? Or are you actually getting called into court to have to testify to the information that you've actually found?
I've never been called to testify. Usually I would prepare what's basically an evidence package that goes to like the in-house counsel, or if they want to involve law enforcement, I'm just providing a coherent package of information.
Right.
But yeah, it's quite funny. Sometimes I don't think people realize that, they think they're advertising their cause and really they're advertising their criminal behavior.
Right.
Yeah.
They're making the evidence very easy to compile of it, I guess.
Yes, exactly.
And so let's talk more about mitigation strategies from a personal perspective. Like, what are the types of, if there's CEOs listening, well, there are CEOs and executives listening to this, entrepreneurs who may be in places and spaces where there is a vocal either minority or whatever that is not pro whatever it is that they're doing as a business. They have some issue with it in some way. What are the types of threat mitigation strategies, at the very minimum, people should start to consider to protect themselves?
For sure. There's been great examples of this, even very recently. So I think it's the Union of BC Municipalities has a big convention every year. And I'm pretty sure there were a few sponsors of the event that had sort of started to become targeted by a lot of climate activists because of various projects they were involved in. So then all of a sudden, the Union of BC Municipalities convention became a target point for activists. Okay,
Right.
this is an easy one. You want to talk about bare minimum things? Require event
Yeah.
registration and then get someone who knows what they're doing, possibly me, to vet the list. It seems that's the kind of
Okay.
like tedious work, but if someone really knows what they're doing, they can say, okay, who is this person? Are they actually a journalist? Or what else have they been involved in? There's a whole kind of sub phenomenon of activist journalists that's become quite problematic,
Right.
or activist photographers. So, that's a tough one, right? Because we do live in a free society, right? But at the same time, there's a big difference between someone who is there in their capacity as, say, a reporter, and someone who's there who's using the reporter title as kind of a veil to then make a nuisance of themselves. And, there have been cases where people will go into what seems like private fundraising dinners. They're dressed up as catering staff, and next thing you know, they break into a coordinated protest stunt where they're singing and throwing fake money in people's faces, or all sorts of things. So yeah, require event registration, vet the list, have like a list of people who are known to disrupt events. You can request that. You could say, could I have a person of interest package of key organizers? Then at least I know who to look out for.
Where does that list normally come from?
That's the type of thing that I would provide. So
Oh,
if a
you
client
create it.
came
I
to
see.
me,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
and part of that, I think that's another sort of point of value that I could add, is that I've just been doing this for well over 5 years straight now. And
Yeah.
so you just kind of get to know over time, okay, what's likely to happen here? Just
Sure.
provide a little bit of perspective, and who are the main people. Like if you see this person, you can know they're a paid organizer with this activist group. They have a long history of getting right up in people's faces, harassing them, trying to film them. Because again, just like any business, you want to promote it. If you're an activist group, you want to promote your cause too. So they'll do anything to get content for social media that paints these industry
Mm.
leaders in the worst possible light.
You made me think about this book by Gavin de Becker called The Gift of Fear. It's written for teens and older, and it's effectively for women, and it's effectively saying, trust your intuition. And it's all the stories of any sort of kidnapping or any bad things that have happened to women, and how the common sense or the belief of safety versus what actually happens. And the whole book, it's a hard book to get through, but the book describes exactly how the scenarios happen and where common sense doesn't match how these things actually take place. And because you've got all this experience in it, I'm sure people come to you and like, oh yeah, we've covered everything. Whereas you're like, okay, you've covered everything that a logical person would think about, but I know what the bad actors think about. And so unless you're a bad actor, you wouldn't think this way.
Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes, I'll run what's called a tabletop exercise. It's kind of fun. You get to do a bit of
Yeah.
creative thinking. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
what's sort of the range of possible things that could happen here? Like,
Yeah.
okay, that guy's just a bit suspicious. Why does he have a giant backpack and sunglasses inside? Okay, we don't know. Let's just have a security guard go over and say, can I help you? Are you looking for something? Like, that's a very low impact intervention. But I'd rather someone just politely ask that person, hey, what's your purpose here? Can we help you? Because you don't know. But then like you say, there could be a whole range. It could go all the way to, we're having people in masks throwing red paint. It's supposed to look like blood. Now they're chaining the doors of this office building closed, and they've locked down the lobby. I'm not making this up. This happened at, I believe, the offices of Chubb Insurance, downtown Vancouver. There was a whole group of people that chained the doors closed, and then people couldn't get out of the building. And, it can happen very quickly too. So, yeah.
You were mentioning earlier in our conversation about how in some cases the kind of nefarious actors have been flown in to do these things, as you said, with the pipeline, right? Like it's not like it's local people, they've actually been flown in. And so, I think there's people that have a strong belief and say, I'm going to protest this thing because I believe in it. But when you start getting to the place of flying people in, doesn't that lead down the path of which I know you've spoken to me about before, of this concept of actually paid agitators or paid protesters that are actually, this is a contracted role. This isn't a personal belief. So talk more about that.
Yeah, I talk about this often because I think people really just don't understand the degree to which this is happening. Like, these are not the Greenpeace protesters from the 1970s that just wanted to save the whales, okay?
Right.
There's actually been cases where local Greenpeace groups have just split up because there was a more radical faction that wanted to really escalate to more direct action, violent forms of protests. And the old school people were like, hey, that's not what we're about. And so you get this, breakup even within some of these groups. But the whole thing about paid protest, it's so difficult because it's often very hard to pin down, okay, where exactly is this money coming from? What is the intent here? There have been suggestions that actually US organizations will fund grassroots groups in Canada to try to undermine our energy industry because they know that Canada has the capacity to become, say, a major LNG exporter, and they don't like that, their northern neighbors are kind of threatening the market. There's also just creepy things that go on. I recently became aware of these, I kid you not, it's called Freedonia. And the grants are specifically for anarchist groups that are willing to take more violent, escalated direct action against anything in the capitalist system. It doesn't really matter what. And they specifically say in the grant description, we want to funnel money to groups that have been unable to secure donations from other sources precisely because they're seen as too radical.
And they have a grant system for this?
They have a grant system. Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds kind of funny, but then you hear.
It does. Very organized.
Yeah. It's a bit ironic, right? Because anarchy is supposed to be kind of system based or whatever. But I think they just realized at a certain point, like, they have to be somewhat systematized because otherwise you'll just get kind of random attacks here or there. Oftentimes, like, rail lines will be sabotaged because so much petroleum products are moved by rail or whatever. Lots of times industrial logging equipment will be subjected to arson as well. But, they know if we really want to have like a mass disruption of transit lines and critical infrastructure, we got to keep the flow of money going. It's very disturbing. Yeah.
That's wild. So
I know, just shake your head, right? It's like, who knew?
There's a grant system is awesome. I mean, I don't know if it's awesome, but it's impressive that that's the way they've gone. I guess I'm curious for listeners who are sitting back and saying, hey, I don't own a company. I don't, but I want to keep myself and my family safe. Like, what are the types of steps that you would want to take, whether it's physical security or whether it's digital security? What are the things that are the first kind of things that people need to think about that they might not know this because they're not you?
Yeah, I would say people often have it reversed, and a lot of the platforms set it up this way on purpose because they like more content than not. But kind of take the opposite approach. Like, if you're going to post something, you're going to think, okay, what's the widest pool of people that could see this? Like you were saying, you keep your Instagram private because, your child's photo, it doesn't matter if she's 3 or 13, like, that just doesn't need to be public content. And that's the right attitude. It's like privacy first and then decide. So, we're going to start a local cycling club. Okay, are we going to host it on Strava? Do we need to host it there? Just kind of having a privacy first mindset, because once something's on the internet, it's forever.
Yes.
Yeah, and people need to know too that just deleting something doesn't necessarily mean it's gone either. There are so many tools to mine like historical pages online. Some people may be aware of something called the Wayback Machine, but it's actually not that hard. Yeah. So privacy first, having good digital hygiene as well. Like, people should just default use a VPN. They're so easy and accessible now, and it just can't hurt. Like, people do not need, Starbucks doesn't need to track your, internet activity through their free Wi-Fi. So turn that on. And I think kind of what you said as well about talking to your children about it too, because, I'm not that old, but even people 10 years younger than me are hyper online, and they simply do not realize the impact that that's going to have on them later. And part of it is you just don't know. So trying to kind of have a real chat about, does that really need to be public or not, especially location tagging.
Which,
Yeah.
Snapchat kind of took off with originally. And I saw it on my daughter's phone, and she's like, "Well, I don't share my location." And I'm like, "But like everybody, you can see exactly where they're at." And then shortly after, Instagram added it as well. And
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden, it's like your location is broadcast everywhere you go. And thankfully, they didn't default. I don't think they defaulted to that setting, but you raise a really good point, especially with children. Like you think, okay, it's not who their Snapchat friends are, it's who has access to their friend's phone. Because
Absolutely.
effectively, anybody that has access to their friend's phone now has access to your child's location from Snapchat if they have that feature turned on.
Mhm. Yeah, the location services thing is just disturbing. And again, I think a lot of it's just a generational mindset. People don't realize because everyone's doing it, that doesn't make it a good thing to do.
Right.
But the delay between doing that and putting your whole life online and then the consequences of it, often there can be a long period of time before the negative effects of that are realized. And so that can make it quite a bit harder. And even for adults too, you just think, well, what's the harm? I like to blog about real estate
Mm-hmm.
trends and so on, but you never know. Maybe now I have pictures of the inside of your house because you decided to take up interior design as a hobby. And like, there's so many combinations of things. And so that's why I always say, just have a privacy first mentality and have good digital hygiene.
Like that. I really like that concept of a privacy first, because you can't dial it back, but you can dial it up if you decide to. But starting in that place means that you're kind of safely dipping your toe in without exposing all your private information out there, which is as you mentioned, is really hard to dial that back once it's actually out there in the world.
Exactly.
And then what do you think now in the we're very you and I are very lucky in that we live in a relatively safe part of the world, probably the safest it's ever been, I would say, to be alive as a human being, even though social media might lead us to believe otherwise. The What do you think from a physical security perspective we should be aware of?
Are you talking about businesses or more individuals?
I think individuals, like as a parent, as a that is worried about their either their spouse or their partner or their kids or their family members, their home. Like, what are the things that we need to be aware of today that maybe aren't top of mind for everybody?
Physical things, I think it's more what kind of access you are inviting. So,
Hmm.
I think I may have mentioned to you before, if you're bored one day, go on Google Street View and see what Google says about what the front of your house looks like. Are there pictures of your cars there that show the license plate numbers? Things like that. Because you can have some of that removed actually, if you know
Yeah.
that it's there. Other things, unfortunately, are just we need to dial up the common sense meter a couple notches. Like people often, as a female, think that maybe, I feel more physical intimidation going into, say, parking garages or whatever. I don't really think it's a gender thing. I think it's more of a common sense thing. If you walk around
Hmm.
and you kind of pull your shoulders back, and let's say you're not sure where you're going, check the directions before you step out of the building so that you can walk out with a more confident posture. You're not sort of making yourself into a target because you clearly look dazed and confused. So just taking a pause, organizing yourself a little bit, do a little digging on yourself, like see, are you posting stupid pictures with fans of cash or your Rolex? Like just stuff like that. Don't make yourself into a target unnecessarily. The privacy first mentality can kind of go to your physical life too. Like enjoy your own
Mm-hmm.
life. You don't need to show it off too much. And if you just,
Mm-hmm.
step out with a confident posture, that will do a lot just to make your day go a little more smoothly.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. There was and I think it was Gavin DeBecker that was interviewed about this as well, when they actually went and interviewed criminal assailants to say, why did you choose this person over the other? And It's they weren't paying attention, so they either had their earphones covering their ears, and they were kind of slouched forward. They didn't look very confident, and they were clearly not aware of their surroundings. And so they pick that person over somebody that's aware and looking around and walking with confidence and walking with purpose. They wouldn't approach that person, and they were giving the various assailants videos and showing them like, who would you target in this. All the assailants targeted the same people and said they'd avoid the same people. So
Yeah.
the point that you're making, right, is mirrored in this research where they're like, yeah, you can do something about this. And I love the way your approach of saying like, hey, if you already know where you're like, don't be standing there confused, staring down at your phone, or don't be
Mm-hmm.
flashing, jewelry. I mean, in I think in London right now, right, and in many major cities, the number of iPhones that get stolen out of people's hands by people
Right
on,
out of people's hands.
yeah, on the
Exactly.
Suron bikes, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I don't know what happened. Like, yeah, well, your phone was out and a person rode by and drove by and grabbed it, right? The jewelry, they're out looking for people in, especially in major cities, right? They're looking for people wearing obvious jewelry. But the worst was they actually found a group, and I think it was in, I can't remember which city it was in, but the service staff in the restaurant were actually paying attention to the watches that were being worn, and then they were texting gang member friends so that when the people left after they paid their dinner, they would get mugged outside. And it kept happening in the same neighborhood, and the police were finally able to piece together that it was connected to the restaurants, that the restaurant
Yeah.
itself, it was the service staff were alerting the gangs that there were people that were wearing expensive watches, and that they would be able to be mugged when they left the restaurant.
Yeah, there's so many layers to that. There's even like the digital equivalent of that. So there was actually
Yeah,
a case. This is actually a little bit more on the cybersecurity side, but I guess there was an
sure.
office building with some kind of lunch restaurant connected to it. And so that they were on the same internet network or something. And a
Yeah.
digital attacker was able to hack into the office system through the payment machines in the lunch restaurant. Because even though the business had relatively good, cybersecurity in place. The internet connected POS machine at the lunch place downstairs didn't. And so they were kind of able to use that as a backdoor because it was one building and I guess they were all technically on the same network. So that kind of coordinated targeting, or sort of, maybe it's not the waiter that actually robbed you, but they're kind of aware, they're working as a team. You just never really know where these things can come from. Yeah,
Wild.
I
This has
know.
been fascinating, Paige. I really appreciate you kind of like sharing your the work you do and just educating our listeners on one, threat assessment, what kind of threats are out there right now, but two, mitigation and some of the strategies that you can take that are, I think the example you gave of the soccer practice is a great example. Like, hey, take the schedule off the website, put it onto a private WhatsApp chat, like super simple, but that right away removes, as you said, it's not just the son, it's also the mom who might be there at the same time with her son at the soccer practice. So two of the family members are now put potentially in danger because this something as simple as, hey, won't we make it easy for the parents by putting up this soccer schedule on the school website, all of a sudden becomes information that a bad actor has access to that I mean, I never would have thought of that example, but you're starting, you're making me think about our own family and the types of things that are accessible about us, that I want to go do some digging on. I think we're doing a good job, but you sort of made me think, okay, I'm going to go look at from as you said, a privacy first lens, which I really like that lens to see what is private and what is public in our world. So thank you for making time to be on the podcast. I've really appreciated this conversation, and it's great to finally know what you do.
Yeah, no, it's no, honestly, it's great to talk about. I think the main thing I would just want to tell people is that it's actually not that hard to make these little changes that could make a big difference later. So,
Hmm.
if you're even like I said, you can be running a small business. It doesn't matter big or small. Making that investment, just find out like what could someone find out about
Hmm.
you. Just empower yourself with that information and then you can make a good decision. Okay, what do I need to change? Sometimes it's not that much, but then you can just have peace of mind and you can run your business like, just like you do, just like I do.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things, just before we wrap here, you comment about Google Maps. And so Google Maps will blur out your house for you if you want. They'll blur out the front of the house. You can also request that information that's publicly available about you actually get taken off Google search as well. You just have to ask them to remove it. And most countries have laws that allow that to happen. And so if there is stuff out there and you're like, I don't want this publicly available, you can apply to have that taken down and any type of mapping stuff blurred as a very easy step. It's not that hard to do. I just go to Google and actually literally Google search how to do it, and Google will tell you what process to go through to protect your privacy in both those cases. So
Yeah, exactly. That's really my key message. Like, find out what's out there about yourself. It's not that hard. I could even do it for you if you want. And then you can make those changes. Oftentimes it's not that much, but a little bit of security goes a long way.
thanks again, Paige.
Thanks, Mike.